Hello guys, welcome to my channel where stories filled with revenge, moral lessons and love are told. Don't forget to like, share this with your friends, and subscribe for more touching stories. I was asleep when the phone rang, slicing through the darkness of my tiny Brooklyn apartment like a warning siren. It was 3 a.m., the kind of hour when dreams are fragile and reality feels distant, and the voice on the other end made my heart drop before I even recognized it. "Clara, your building's on fire. Hope you're insured," said my father. Daniel Harrow, his tone casual yet laced with that Midwestern bluntness I knew too well. There was no panic in his voice, only that practical, accounting-driven matter of factness that had haunted my childhood. I blinked at the ceiling, the absurdity of the situation hitting me before fear did. I laughed, not a small laugh, but a long, hollow burst that startled me in the dark. I laughed because my paintings weren't at home. They were already staged at the gallery uptown for my first major exhibition. I laughed because the smoke might have consumed my possessions, but it couldn't touch the life I had built outside those walls. I laughed because, for once, I could see the ridiculousness in all the careful plans and warnings my father had given me about stability and security. I threw on a hoodie and jogged down the narrow stairs of the building, the fire trucks arriving, with their wailing sirens as the first neighbors spilled into the street, their faces etched with disbelief. Flames licked the upper floors, painting the night sky orange and black, a grotesque sunset over our shared misfortune. My neighbor, Mrs. Lynn, clutched a box of papers and photographs, tears streaking down her face. I offered her a hand, but words failed me. The scene was surreal, like a twisted performance, and I felt detached from it all, my mind circling back to my artwork and the gallery that had patiently waited for weeks. The irony wasn't lost on me. The thing I had worked for, sacrificed for, was untouched, while the place I called home, filled with memories, was reduced to ashes. The smell of smoke was thick in the air, clinging to hair, clothing, skin, and yet even as I breathed it in, I felt a strange clarity, a sharp reminder that nothing truly belonged to me except my choices and my creations. The fire department cordoned off the street, and we were told that the building was completely unsafe. Tenants whispered about faulty wiring, negligence, and some even muttered the word arson, though fear kept them from speaking loudly. I wandered among the crowd, cataloging faces I had known for years, the grumpy old man from 3B who always yelled about loud music, the couple from the second floor who made the best apple pie in winter, and young artists like me who had scraped rent together for years, forming an unlikely family in a structure that was barely holding itself together. Daniel appeared at the edge of the chaos, his hair disheveled, briefcase in hand as if he had come straight from a meeting to witness catastrophe. He looked at me, eyebrows raised. "Laughing still?" he asked. I nodded, not because it was funny, but because it was my only shield against the panic, my way of claiming control over something utterly uncontrollable. Later that morning, as the fire died down and the building smoldered in ruin, I wandered through the street, talking to other tenants and trying to comprehend the scale of the damage. Some had lost everything from furniture to family heirlooms, photographs to clothes. I could see the despair etched in every face, a weight I had never imagined carrying. I met Javier, a young musician who lived down the hall. He clutched a charred guitar, his eyes wide with shock. "All gone," he whispered. I placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the vibration of grief through him. We shared a moment of quiet understanding that our lives, though shattered in different ways, were now irrevocably intertwined. Even as I comforted him, I felt the first stirrings of a plan. Laughter had been my shield in the night. Now clarity was my weapon. Something about this fire didn't feel accidental. I didn't know why yet, but the way the flames had consumed certain areas while leaving others untouched, the timing, the new management team recently installed by North Star Development, pieces of a puzzle began to click. My father had always been pragmatic, often to the point of coldness, but his mind was a steel trap for details and numbers. Watching him move through the chaos, notebook in hand, I realized that our strengths could complement each other. While my heart beat in rhythm with emotion and creativity, his processed reality through logic and scrutiny. When he leaned over a crumpled building plan, muttering calculations, I knew I could trust him to look for patterns I might overlook. Together, we started asking questions that no one else dared to voice aloud. Why now? Why this building? Why did the fire seem almost selective? These questions, though small, marked the first steps toward understanding that what felt like random tragedy might actually be orchestrated strategy. Neighbors began congregating in a nearby diner, a temporary refuge from the smoke and debris. Coffee and stale muffins were offered, but no one touched them immediately. Fear and disbelief held everyone hostage. I found myself sketching on napkins, instinctively capturing the twisted skeletal remains of my building, the way the fire had shaped the space and the people left in its shadow. Art had always been my solace, and now it became my anchor. Through every stroke of pencil and ink, I processed the complex tangle of loss, relief, and anger. It was there, amid murmured conversations and the smell of burnt timber, that I realized laughter had not been denial, it had been recognition. I was alive. My art was alive. And even though we had lost walls and roofs, we had not lost the truth. Calls came from friends, gallery curators, and local media, all eager to know what had happened. I explained in calm, measured tones that my exhibition would proceed, that my work was safe, but I did not mention suspicions, the small threads of doubt forming in my mind about North Star's role. I needed evidence first. Outrage without proof could weaken us. Yet I felt the first flickers of determination, a resolve that extended beyond survival. This was no longer about a single apartment. It was about the community, the rights we had as tenants, and the justice that needed to follow. I glanced at my father as he organized documents, his furrowed brow betraying a rare intensity. "We'll figure it out," I said softly. He nodded, eyes meeting mine with unspoken agreement. The partnership we had avoided for decades suddenly seemed inevitable. By noon, city inspectors arrived, snapping photos and taking statements. The smell of charred wood and melted plastics lingered, and yet even amidst the horror, I noticed small acts of resilience, neighbors helping each other salvage possessions, sharing blankets, and offering reassurances. I met Mrs. Patel, who had lived on the 4th floor for 30 years. She held an album close to her chest, tears spilling as she described memories etched in the pages. I promised to help her find replacements for lost photographs, or at least document her story. That promise marked the first intersection of my art with activism. I realized that these experiences, though painful, could become testimony, narrative, and ultimately power against the forces threatening our homes. As evening fell, the city lights reflecting off the wet streets, I felt the laughter from earlier that morning transform into something more focused. It was no longer shocking. It was a mixture of anger, disbelief, and strategic energy. I walked past the building's charred remains one last time, imprinting every detail in my mind. Shapes of doors, the way flames had eaten corners faster than expected, the selective survival of certain apartments, all of it lingered. I knew, deep down, that this fire was a turning point, not just for me, but for everyone whose life had been disrupted, for the community we would rebuild, and for the forces that had dared to think they could erase us. My father joined me silently, and together we stared at the ruins, understanding that laughter had been the first step toward reclaiming control, and the next steps would demand cunning, courage, and relentless perseverance. The morning after the fire, as the sun rose over the smoky skyline, the reality of our loss began to sink in. Clara Easton, that's me now. My name changed from the old family name Harrow. A little rebellion against the weight of legacy stood on the edge of what had been my home. Neighbors moved cautiously, their faces etched with shock, but beneath it, I could sense something else, a simmering anger that had nowhere to go. We had been victims, yes, but victims of what? That question burned hotter than any flame that had taken our building. Over coffee at a nearby cafe, I met with some of my closest neighbors. Javier, a young musician with relentless optimism. Mrs. Patel, steadfast and protective of the memories of 30 years. And Elena, a writer whose sharp eyes missed nothing. We began piecing together fragments of stories, snippets of suspicious maintenance reports, and rumors about the building's new ownership. North Star Development had bought our block only months prior. Their manager, a slick, overconfident man named Lucas Byrne, seemed more interested in profit margins than in human lives. Small things began to make sense. why the fire alarms were faulty, why the sprinklers had malfunctioned, why repairs had been delayed until the wood rotted and wires frayed. It was systematic neglect, but the possibility of deliberate orchestration loomed over us like a shadow. I remember the sense of disbelief when Javier muttered, "Are we saying they actually set this fire?" He didn't want to believe it, but the idea refused to leave our minds. My father, now acting less like the pragmatic accountant and more like a detective, took detailed notes, connecting dots between the company's financial statements, building, inspections, and the timing of the purchase. I began documenting everything visually. My sketches, which had been merely artistic exercises, became investigative tools. I drew the twisted beams, the charred stairwells, the apartments untouched by fire. Patterns emerged. Certain units had been left almost intact, others completely destroyed. The randomness was anything but random. Art, which had once been my private sanctuary, now became a lens to expose injustice. I worked late into nights, at the gallery, drawing, photographing, and even starting small installations to capture the devastation. It felt strange to feel purpose so intensely, knowing that my work was no longer just for beauty or personal satisfaction. It was becoming testimony, evidence, and a platform for our voices. Word spread quickly among the tenants. We started holding nightly meetings in whatever spaces we could find, discussing strategies, sharing information, and supporting one another emotionally. The fire had displaced us, but it had also united us. Elena suggested using social media to raise awareness, documenting not just the destruction but the personal stories of loss and resilience. We created a private group, and soon dozens of tenants were posting photos, recounting their memories, and demanding accountability. The digital archive became a living record of both the fire and the systematic neglect that preceded it. I realized that community was more than proximity. It was a shared purpose, mutual protection, and collective action. Meanwhile, my father dug deeper into North Star's financial history. He discovered offshore accounts, suspicious property acquisitions, and inconsistencies in the company's tax filings. Each revelation was a thread connecting the company to a broader network of influence, including city officials who had turned a blind eye to repeated complaints about unsafe conditions. He shared his findings with me, not in technical jargon, but in a way I could translate into visual language. I began planning an art installation, an experiential piece that combined sketches, photographs, and documents to immerse viewers in the reality of accelerated vacancy, the corporate practice of displacing rent-controlled tenants for profit. My role as an artist was evolving into that of a storyteller, historian, and activist, and the boundaries between personal grief and social responsibility blurred. Intimidation soon followed. One night, I returned to the cafe after photographing charred debris at the site and found a note slipped under my sketchbook. "Stop digging or you'll regret it." My pulse raced, but I refused to show fear. When I showed it to my father, he nodded grimly. "They're worried we'll expose them," he said, as if the note validated our suspicion rather than threatened us. This tiny act of defiance fueled our determination. The tenants, once victims, were now participants in a slow, deliberate fight against corporate malfeasance. We were no longer isolated individuals but a coalition armed with evidence, witness accounts, and art that could resonate emotionally with the public. Over the following weeks, the coalition grew. Former skeptics joined after seeing the meticulous work my father had done with the financial documents and my sketches illustrating the scale of negligence. We started meeting with local journalists, providing them curated documentation and narratives, guiding them to understand not only the fire but the systemic issues at play. Each interaction became a calculated step, blending emotion, visual evidence, and the hard numbers that my father had unearthed. The public started paying attention, and the tension that had loomed over our community shifted from fear to empowerment. The more we uncovered, the more personal the stakes became. Neighbors revealed losses that were irrecoverable: wedding albums, handwritten letters, mementos of children who had grown up in the building. Each story became a thread in a tapestry of outrage, motivating me to push harder in my creative work. I converted the gallery space into a provisional hub for the coalition, hosting story nights where tenants could recount their experiences. I recorded these sessions, adding sketches to highlight their narratives. The resulting archive captured a raw humanity that statistics alone could never convey. As I stood before the drawings and photos, I understood that our fight was bigger than revenge. It was about documenting the truth and holding power accountable. Legal action became a natural extension of our work. We consulted lawyers and discovered that North Star had not only violated safety codes but also likely manipulated city inspection schedules. My father worked alongside the legal team, providing detailed analyses that connected the dots between corporate profits, regulatory oversight, and the fire itself. Every spreadsheet, every receipt, every email he unearthed became ammunition in our case. It was a strange and satisfying symbiosis of my creativity translating the human cost, his logic tracing the financial culpability. Together, we were unstoppable. A fusion of emotional truth and factual clarity. By the time the city began formally investigating, our coalition had grown to dozens of tenants and community members. Social media coverage amplified our cause, and local news outlets began broadcasting interviews and features. I watched from the gallery as neighbors, once isolated and defeated, became spokespeople, their voices echoing through screens and newspapers. The fire that had displaced us had inadvertently forged a movement, and our shared outrage became a tool for systemic change. It was thrilling, terrifying, and deeply satisfying to see fear transform into organized action. In those days, late at night, I often returned to my sketches of the charred building. Flames were etched with meticulous care, doorways highlighted with strokes of charcoal, hallways captured in jagged lines that conveyed both destruction and resilience. My father would sit nearby, quietly reviewing documents, the two of us working side by side in an unspoken partnership. Our relationship had shifted from tension over life choices to mutual respect and collaboration, bonded by a shared purpose. We laughed occasionally, recalling his initial 3 a.m. phone call and my surreal reaction. The absurdity of that night had given way to an intense, focused drive that neither of us could have anticipated. Through weeks of investigation, documentation, and community organizing, it became clear that the fire was part of a deliberate pattern. North Star had a history of purchasing aging buildings, neglecting maintenance, and then using accidental fires to clear tenants of an accelerated vacancy scheme that had displaced countless families across the city. The revelation hardened our resolve. We were no longer just recovering from personal loss. We were fighting for every displaced tenant whose story might otherwise vanish. The coalition had transformed our grief into collective action, blending art, evidence, and social advocacy into a single, unstoppable force. The momentum we had built over months of documentation, community meetings, and social media exposure finally reached a tipping point. Clara Easton, me, and my coalition of tenants had become a formidable presence, impossible for North Star Development or city officials to ignore. I remember the first day we walked into the city council offices, a group of 30 or more residents, each carrying evidence of our losses, sketches, photographs, and financial anomalies my father had uncovered. Daniel Harrow, my father, stood beside me, his suit immaculate, eyes sharp with determination. We had learned to trust one another completely. His numbers, my visuals, our combined voice forming a narrative that could not be dismissed. Lobbyists and corporate lawyers may have underestimated us, but we had truth, persistence, and community on our side. The hearings were tense. North Star representatives tried their usual tactics: denial, minimization, and feigned ignorance. Lucas Byrne, the same manager who had seemed untouchable, appeared before us, attempting to charm and deflect. I could feel the collective frustration in the room, a mixture of anger, fear, and hope that something real might emerge from the chaos. I presented my art installation first, a visceral experience that took the council members through the devastation, highlighting individual stories of lost homes, memories, and stability. My sketches of the fire's destruction, the selective nature of the damage, and the preserved apartments drew audible reactions, gasps, murmurs, and, in some cases, the undeniable realization of neglect or worse. The room was silent, captivated by the human truth I was presenting, a stark contrast to the polished corporate statements of the defendants. My father followed, presenting the financial evidence: offshore accounts, irregularities in maintenance budgets, and discrepancies in city inspection reports. He traced the flow of money from building neglect to potential profit, mapping North Star's operations with precision that was impossible to dispute. The combination of art and analytics struck an unexpected chord. Members of the council leaned forward, taking notes, visibly disturbed by the systematic nature of the neglect. I glanced around at my neighbors, who had fought tirelessly, many of whom had lost everything, and felt a surge of pride and solidarity. The fire that had displaced us had also forged an unbreakable bond. We were not just reclaiming our homes. We were demanding accountability on behalf of everyone who had been silenced by corporate indifference. Media coverage amplified our efforts. Local news outlets ran stories on our coalition, featuring interviews with displaced tenants and highlighting the art installation that had transformed abstract negligence into a tangible, emotional experience. Public sentiment began to shift against North Star. Investors started questioning their stakes, and city officials faced increasing pressure to act. The combination of visual storytelling, factual evidence, and grassroots activism created a perfect storm. For the first time, I saw the potential for real change. The fire, once a symbol of loss and despair, had become a catalyst for justice and rebuilding. Legal challenges continued to escalate. North Star tried to suppress information, issuing cease and desist letters, threatening lawsuits, and intimidating tenants. But the coalition stood firm. Javier, Elena, Mrs. Patel, and countless others became fearless spokespeople, their courage amplified by the meticulous work my father and I had compiled. Each challenge only strengthened our resolve, and as we navigated hearings, press conferences, and community rallies, I realized that the art I had once created for personal expression had evolved into a powerful tool for advocacy. Every line, every sketch, every photo was a voice speaking for those who could no longer be heard. Months passed, and the investigation gained momentum. The city's formal inquiry revealed widespread violations, corroborating our claims that the fire was no accident and that North Star had engaged in a deliberate pattern of neglect. Criminal charges were filed against key executives, including Lucas Byrne. Investor scrutiny forced structural changes in the company, and the public outcry pressured officials to implement reforms to protect rent-controlled tenants. Our coalition's strategy had worked. By blending creativity, analytical precision, and unyielding persistence, we had turned personal tragedy into systemic accountability. Amid the chaos, my personal life also transformed. My relationship with my father evolved beyond grudging respect into genuine partnership. We had learned to bridge the gap between pragmatism and passion, finance and art, logic and emotion. Late nights spent poring over documents and sketches were no longer tedious or tense. They became collaborative moments that strengthened our bond. He marveled at the power of storytelling through visual art, and I gained a deep appreciation for the rigor and discipline of financial investigation. Together, we had become a force that neither of us could have imagined individually. The rebuilding process began in earnest. The settlement awarded to the coalition funded new affordable housing units, tenant advocacy programs, and long-term support for displaced families. Watching our community take root again, seeing neighbors move into newly constructed apartments, and witnessing the joy on the faces of children who had lost everything was profoundly moving. The fire that had once symbolized destruction now represented transformation, resilience, and the unyielding power of collective action. My sketches from the early days of the fire were displayed as part of a permanent installation in one of the rebuilt buildings, a testament to the journey from despair to empowerment. Through the process, I realized that art was more than aesthetic. It was a conduit for justice. My exhibitions, once centered purely on beauty and expression, now carried narratives of struggle, resilience, and advocacy. The gallery visitors, journalists, and community members who experienced the installations left with a visceral understanding of housing injustice and the human cost of corporate greed. Art had allowed us to tell the story that numbers and testimony alone could not fully capture, bridging emotional gaps and compelling people to act. The coalition's success also sparked dialogue in other neighborhoods facing similar threats. Our work inspired tenant groups across the city to investigate negligent landlords and corporate misconduct, creating a ripple effect that extended beyond Brooklyn. By combining strategic activism with creative storytelling, we had created a blueprint for grassroots advocacy in urban housing. It was thrilling to see our local struggle resonate on a larger scale, demonstrating that even small communities could challenge systemic corruption when armed with truth, courage, and ingenuity. Looking back, the fire that had begun as an unimaginable loss was the turning point of my life. I had laughed in disbelief at 3 a.m., not knowing the scope of the battle ahead. But through art, community, and the unexpected alliance with my father, I discovered an inner strength and purpose I had never anticipated. The journey had demanded persistence, creativity, and emotional resilience, but it had also brought profound rewards: restored housing, justice for the displaced, and the empowerment of a community united against injustice. The experience reshaped my identity, reinforced my commitment to advocacy, and deepened my bond with the people who had stood beside me. As I stood once more outside the rebuilt building, sketches in hand and father by my side, I felt a sense of closure and renewal. The flames had taken our home, but they had also ignited a movement, transformed relationships, and demonstrated the power of courage, creativity, and relentless determination. Every charred beam, every story of loss, and every act of resistance had contributed to a legacy far greater than any single apartment or material possession. The community thrived, the art endured, and justice prevailed. We had turned ashes into a foundation for something enduring, something more powerful than mere survival. Through it all, I realized that destruction often precedes creation, that loss can catalyze unexpected growth, and that courage combined with creativity can achieve what seemed impossible. The fire was the spark, but we, the community, the coalition, and the individuals who refused to be silenced were the force that turned tragedy into triumph. And as I continue to create, advocate, and tell our story, I know that the lessons learned, the bonds forged, and the victories won will continue to resonate far beyond the streets of Brooklyn, touching hearts and inspiring action wherever injustice threatens the vulnerable. Like this story? Make sure to like, subscribe, share with friends, and leave a comment with your thoughts and lessons learned.